Added to the fear of contracting the virus in a pandemic are the significant changes to our daily lives as our movements are restricted in support of efforts to contain and slow down the spread of the coronavirus. Faced with new realities of working from home, homeschooling our children, and lack of physical contact with other family members, friends, and colleagues, it is important that we take good care of our mental health. To speak about just that, we have with us Vikram Patel, the Pershing Square Professor of Global Health in the Blavatnik Institute's Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He is also an adjunct professor and joint director at the Center for Chronic Conditions and Injuries at the Public Health Foundation of India. He will be in conversation with senior journalist and author Kaveri Bamzai.
One of the things I heard you talking about recently was this idea of the unconditional income support to prevent stress and mental health illness. That's a fantastic idea. Would you like to discuss it a little more?
Absolutely. Actually, I've had the privilege of mentoring a very bright young Brazilian postdoctoral fellow who works with me in my lab in Harvard. And she has been analyzing the impact of Brazil's conditional cash transfer program, which is probably the largest direct to beneficiary cash transfer program that was launched by the government of Lula about 20 years ago. And it was really an effort to raise the income levels of the poor in Brazil and reduce disparities. It is astonishing, Kaveri. Her data shows, and this is more than 100 million people, so it's the largest, almost a countrywide program. Her data shows convincingly that when people receive conditional cash transfers, not only is their economic status improved, but suicide mortality has dropped by 50%, as much as 50% during the decade following receipt of the conditional cash transfer, and in particular amongst young people. And the disparities between the Black Brazilians, which is historically one of the more disadvantaged communities in Brazil, and white Brazilians has narrowed. To me, this is the largest compelling demonstration about the value of conditional cash transfers or even unconditional cash transfers like universal basic income interventions on promoting the mental health of populations, particularly those who are economically in the weaker segments of society.
Would a Manrega not qualify as a cash transfer? Would it has there been any study that looks at this?
Well, MNREGA is a cash transfer
Yeah.
program. It's obviously, though, it is linked to actually having rural employment. And if obviously, if there is no jobs in the rural areas, then you're not going to get rural employment. So in that sense, it is a cash transfer program with lots of restrictions and limitations. The Brazilian program is direct to the beneficiary. You don't actually have to be working at all. So I think there are differences, but fundamentally, there is a commonality in that the state is directly transferring money to people who are relatively poor and therefore have no other source of income. Now, that said, a bigger question is, have we evaluated
Yes.
the impact of MNREGA on people's health and well-being, particularly their mental health? Not that I know of, but I will say something very curious about our cash transfer programs, which is the opposite of giving a cash to help people promote their mental health. And that is, of course, the compensation we give families of farmers who've committed suicide. And I remember very vividly, I used to work a lot in the Vidarbha area for many years. And I remember very vividly being in one of the villages where there had been a number of farmer suicides. And I remember this woman whose husband had died coming to me in tears. And she said, we got this compensation after my husband killed himself. I do not understand why the government didn't give him the money in the form of debt relief. It was, and I stood there, and I had no answer. And I said, so we have effectively incentivized suicide. It's such a bizarre policy dynamic that instead of saying, let us give money to those who need it so that they can actually get on with their lives and rebuild their lives, instead we say, no, after you kill yourself, we'll then give the money to your surviving family. I don't know. This is the kind of perverse system that defies any logic here. But anyway, that's a contrast to a lot of our cash transfer programs in India. We give it at the wrong time rather than it's not a preemptive, cash transfer. It's actually a reactive cash transfer, which I think is a wasted opportunity and a wasted life.
That's Peeply Live all over again. The movie was all about this.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
You
Actually,
remember?
of course, I
Yeah.
remember the movie.
Yeah,
Terrific film.
yeah. You know, the other thing that has struck me over this period that we've been through is the family dynamic. You know, there's been a lot of talk about domestic violence, about physical and psychological abuse within the family increasing. Again, I've not read any data as such, but there's been a lot of conversation around that. Have you looked at that, especially in India? We've heard a lot of cases of substance abuse as well going up, especially alcohol. Have you seen that? Have you studied that?
You know, I'll tell you, Kaveri, one of the real problems right now with the pandemic is how little reliable data there is
Right.
on all of these consequences of the pandemic, and particularly the consequences of the lockdown and the containment policy. So, what we rely on isn't really the kind of data that I would say can easily generalize to the whole country. The qualitative studies, very focused deep dives, individual narratives of their experiences, etc. The extent to which we can generalize this, I don't know, but those stories certainly speak to what you just described, that the vulnerabilities of women who already were vulnerable because they lived, for example, in relationships where there was spousal violence, has increased dramatically. The
Mm.
vulnerabilities of children
Mm.
living in those families to be exposed to violence has increased. And of course, now children are trapped at home,
Exactly.
oftentimes with nowhere else to go. And school is often an escape. It's not just a
Yeah.
place, where kids went to learn geography and history. It's a place where kids went often to get away from very
Yeah.
difficult home environments, to get food, to be able to play, to be able to interact with one's peers. But so all of these, there's a lot of qualitative data that I think speaks to this. But if I had to look at quantitative data, we already have very good quantitative data from other countries.
Right.
And there is no reason for me to believe that India is going to somehow necessarily be totally different.
Right.
And the one country, as you know, I live between India and the US. In the US, we now have robust quantitative data that is showing without any doubt that mortality, which is the hard outcome of that we're all concerned with, has risen in the last year due to suicide and substance use. This is a very dangerous trend in the US, and it is being attributed. Obviously, these are early data. In fact, this is actually a report that is still confidential, but will be published in the very near future. But what it's clearly indicating is that there is a crisis of mental health in the US that is playing itself out, not just in terms of people reporting poor mental health symptoms, but actually people taking actions that can ultimately lead to the loss of their own lives. For example, through heavy drinking, the use of more dangerous substances like opioids, as well as, of course, suicide. Unfortunately, our data systems in India are nowhere near as real time as the one in the US. So we'll probably only know what the impact has been in the last year, and perhaps in a year from now, which is
Right.
unfortunate.
Do you feel that the family has changed fundamentally during this period? And is that change irreversible? Or can we make interventions to actually prevent a lot of the psychological abuse that has happened?
Kaveri, I wouldn't be able to comment specifically on the change in the family during the last year. I don't have that kind of information to comment on it. But I will say one thing is that actually working with families, in my mind, is the most important way to
Yeah.
prevent gender-based violence. Right now, our state policy is very reactive.
Yeah.
We wait for the violence to occur,
Yeah.
and then we try to help the woman who is affected to find a way around that. And in a patriarchal society like ours, we know that actually the vast majority of women neither seek that kind of help
Right.
because they're, in a sense, entrapped really in this kind of society that they are living in, but also that the solutions we're offering them, that is to criminalize their male partner
Yeah.
or to get them to leave homes, are really acceptable to a very small fraction
Yes.
of women in our country. So I strongly believe that we do need to look at prevention, primary prevention, which is to say to prevent the violence from occurring in the very first
Right.
place. And while we have good legislative instruments for that, I fear those legislative instruments are still too reactive. They're very punitive. They're very much around the idea of criminalizing
Right.
the male perpetrator. I believe that really exciting kind of evidence that that people are generating in India. There's a team, for example, that is working from Nari in Pune, which is looking at interventions that can work on spousal relationships, couple dynamics.
Okay.
And I've always wondered, why do we not use the opportunity when couples register to get married to
Correct.
actually require them to actually have a month or intense deep dive of understanding how to live with someone else?
Right.
Because let's not forget that for a significant majority of young people who are going to get married in India, their first sexual encounter,
Yes.
their first encounter of living with someone in a romantic relationship, their first encounter of being able to create a new family for themselves will happen on the night of their marriage.
Yes.
And it is like, there's no preparation.
Yeah.
Their own parents have not prepared them. School education, the sex education, the life skills you get there is pretty, in most cases, it's very poorly delivered and it's pretty primitive. They have no knowledge.
Right.
And I think this could be such an exciting and preventative intervention, not only to prevent domestic violence, but actually to promote mental health and well being for both young men and young women who are about to get married.
I think that's fascinating. But, Dr. Patel, you've also talked about this whole idea how, because of the criminalizing of a lot of love as well, especially if it's interfaith, even that escape, even that freedom, once it gets criminalized, I mean, where does it leave young people? It leaves them very dejected, doesn't it?
Well, Kaveri, I think you're referring to my recent writings here.
Yes.
Let me tell you first of all, India has a crisis of young people's mental health.
Yeah.
Every metric, and by crisis, I don't mean just young people are angry or young people are sad. No, young people are killing themselves. In epic numbers. The India's youth suicide rate is one of the highest on the planet. And it has been steadily going up over the last decade. We've known about this, and by the way, these are not my data; these are the government's own data.
Yes.
So there's
The
no secret
NCRB
about.
data. Yeah.
Correct, the NCRB data and the RGI data, the Million Death Study that the Registrar General of India conducts, which I think is far more reliable, because it's not based on police records, but actually, or cause of death assessments in a representative sample of 1 million households in the country. So the fact is that there is a crisis of young people's mental health. The fact is, we have no policy response to it. We have a national mental health policy, which is a policy, but actually there is very little recognition of the differing needs of young people and the rest of the population. And also the fact that most young people's mental health problems are not just linked to some kind of biological medical condition or a psychiatric disorder. It's got to do with the social environments that young people are finding themselves in. And one of those very important social drivers of young people's suicide and poor mental health is the denial of opportunities that fit the aspirations of India's millennials. And those aspirations are totally different from those of their parents. They are shaped by India's economic development story, they're shaped by globalization, and of course, they're shaped by social media. And so we have this generation of India's youth who have different aspirations from that of their parents and grandparents.
Right.
And there is literally a real battle about whose aspirations are going to prevail.
Yeah.
And in that battle right now, the emergence of very conservative, orthodox attitudes about young people's sexuality and their right to choose who they love, who they live with, is, I think, at the forefront of what is driving many young people to become depressed and
Yes.
ultimately to kill themselves.
Right. Dr. Patel, you've also argued for the decriminalizing of marijuana, which again is a very contentious topic in India. But I mean, it stands to reason, doesn't it? Of course, a lot of people feel that it's the gateway to harder drugs. But what do you think? I mean, what do you think should happen in India? We don't have an obvious opioid crisis, but I think we do have a rising drug issue in India.
Yeah, we definitely, it's not a clear cut case. It depends very much on you know, assessing the relative costs and benefits of a total prohibitionary policy on
Yeah.
any substance has to be then balanced against the similar cost benefit analysis of a more liberal, decriminalized, or even a legalized policy. And one has to really judge this in a very empirical way. One can't be guided only by one's ideology.
Mm.
And this is my understanding of the situation, that by criminalizing about what could be potentially 10% of India's population, you are not going to achieve any kind of development goal, especially when 99% of those 10% will never graduate to more serious substances. That's the first thing to bear in mind. So, in order to control the gateway to harder drugs by slamming a criminal charge on the overwhelming majority of users of cannabis who will never get into more serious drug use seems to me to be completely counterintuitive. Instead, there are many other ways that I know work in the public health context that can help minimize the graduation into more serious drugs. So that's the first thing to say. The second, the opioid crisis in the US, which is where the country, the country that's been worst affected, is not just simply about the availability of drugs. It's about the medical industrial complex. There is a rich history about this. It is about pharmaceutical companies that were heavily lobbying the US government to
Mm.
make pain relief one of the five cardinal signs of patient care. The US Congress actually passed a law requiring doctors to actually prescribe medications that their pharmaceutical donors and sponsors were saying they should prescribe.
Right.
It is a systematic collusion between doctors, pharmacists, the pharmaceutical industry, and elected officials. And I think we should not think the opioid is the problem here. The problem is the commercialization and the deep, deep state, the dark state that exists between the pharmaceutical lobby and politicians. We need to protect India from that.
Right.
If there is one lesson, what is far more dangerous than the drug itself is the collusion of private sector commercial interests with with legislation and our elected officials. As long as we continue to make sure that if we decriminalize drugs, but do it purely under a state-sponsored policy,
Right.
where the sale and distribution of drugs is entirely controlled by the state, is heavily regulated, is heavily taxed, under the same kinds of rules in many ways to what we do for tobacco.
Mm.
Actually, tobacco is commercialized, and you can see that. But if you remove the commercial interest, but everything else is similar to tobacco: taxation, to
Right.
prohibition of young people's use, provision of counseling for those who want to stop, etc. I believe that is a safe and more balanced policy towards cannabis in our country.
Right. Let's go back a little to the mental health issue, the pandemic. How did you see India reacting? I'm especially concerned about the middle class because they've often been the intellectual and emotional leaders of the country. I had the sense that when we saw the kind of migration happening, people just being abandoned, I had the sense that we displayed an utter lack of empathy and sensitivity. Do you feel that somewhere the middle class has lost that leadership of the country in a way?
Yeah, well, Kaveri, this is such a troubling question, because obviously you and me belong to that same
Yes,
class. And so we're talking about our own class here,
ourselves.
ourselves and our class, our families, our social networks, people we dine with, we
Yeah.
live with. I'll be honest with you, I was devastated by how my class, our class, has responded, but not surprised.
Hmm.
Um, I think what the pandemic has done is expose the deep class divisions that have existed in this country for decades. But I have to say, the degree of callousness that was displayed by the upper and middle classes, a small cabal of those classes, the legislators of our country, the wealthy more generally, to the plight of the vast majority of our country who found themselves dispossessed on the streets, hungry, trudging home under the most appalling conditions and facing police violence as they did that, left me completely stunned. And I'm sure you must know of the book by Harsh Mandar,
Yeah.
Locking Down the Poor.
Oh my God,
I
that is
do.
such
It
an
is,
indictment of us,
yeah,
you know.
it is a heartrending and brutal, but absolutely on the mark account of how India's upper classes looked away when the majority of our people needed us the most. Um,
Right.
and I believe this division has also woken up the rest of our country to realizing how callous, selfish, and uncaring upper classes are,
Yeah,
and that when it comes to the crunch, India's poor and marginalized are on their own. We're
absolutely.
not going to be standing out for them.
Right. And I think that's a terribly harsh lesson, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it is a harsh lesson, and it tells you how long a distance we have to go as a society to build a civil society that is
Right.
truly integrated. We talk of national identity. To me, actually, I don't think we have one. If there was ever a proof that we don't stand together as a nation, what happened during and after the lockdown is vivid proof that we only stood for ourselves and our particular class.
Yeah.
That is what mattered. You know, I remember the Resident Welfare Association colonies of Delhi, where the only concern of the colonies was not to let my servants go out of the
Exactly.
house
Yeah.
because they will bring the virus back and infect me. As opposed to thinking, what are my servants' families doing
Yeah.
as they are locked into my house and they are locked out of the colony?
Right.
It staggered the imagination that all that we could think about was our own safety and our own needs. And that it almost became, at times, conversations I would have with people in those colonies. It almost sounded like you're talking about slaves. You're talking indentured laborers. It was shocking, beyond belief shocking. But I think the good thing I'll tell you in this is that the vast majority of India's people now realize
Yeah.
that we are not going to be around for them, and that they're going to have to make the right decisions in terms of their livelihoods, the political choices they make, that is going to actually stand for their interests.
Yeah, and I hope they make the right choices. The other thing I think that we've not talked about enough as a society is the impact on young children who've actually lost a year of socializing, of playing with their peers, of studying in classrooms, especially early age. I wonder what kind of impact it must have had on their psychology.
Yeah, I have been very worried about this, Kaveri. The first thing to say is that that's another great example of how those who have no voice
Yeah,
have had no place at the table when decisions were made.
right.
We've just talked about the migrant workers and more generally India's, daily wage workers, not just migrant workers. Let's be honest, the people who are most affected by the lockdown are those who earn every day.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
absolutely.
don't earn every day. It affected me not at all.
Right,
But if I was earning every day, what I ate tomorrow was based on what I earned today.
right.
Then obviously a strategy like a lockdown basically means I'll go hungry tomorrow, and so will my wife or my husband and my kids. So in the same way, I would argue children's voices have also been completely blanked out.
Right.
Yet we have taken away from children
Yeah.
the single most important sector for their development and their well-being, which is their
Yeah.
schools. What have we done? We've essentially reduced schools to places of learning,
Yeah.
firstly, which is of course a completely false and narrow narrative of what schools actually are for
Yeah.
kids. But secondly, we've assumed that all of India's kids have access to remote learning opportunities. I
Exactly.
mean, I cannot even,
Boggles the mind.
it's mind-boggling, right? I mean, you're living in a country, you say, I mean, are you even aware of what India's children's experiences
Right.
are to assume that teachers at institutions, particularly in the government sector, and the kids who go there will automatically pivot to remote learning? I mean, are you even living in a real India? Yeah, do you have connection with reality? And again, I have to say it's another great example of how we've totally thrown our children under the bus. In Goa, where I am right now, here's the incredible thing: casinos have already opened. Casinos opened 3 to 4 months ago.
But not
Schools are
schools.
still closed. Just think about that. Who have we prioritized? Gamblers to come to Goa to gamble on ships versus our own children to get into schools and start doing what schools, in experience
Yeah.
what schools actually offer children. What a bizarre set of policies. How we prioritize in this country sometimes leaves me completely baffled.
Absolutely, and I think you only have to be present at when a midday meal is served to see the hunger, and it's so brutal, when you see children just lining up to eat. Just that experience, just take. I mean, forget about learning, forget about socializing. Some kids just come to eat. They don't get
Absolutely.
enough.
And by the way, Kaveri, that's not only true in India. This is also true in the U.S.
Right.
My own colleagues in Harvard, when the pandemic began, they were calling for school closures, and this was, obviously done to only control the pandemic. They hadn't thought about the impact that had on kids. Today, the very same colleagues say, well, actually, the policy should be this, and I'm actually going to paraphrase what they said. Schools should be the last to close and
Right.
the first to open.
Yeah.
And I think that tells you why, what the central role of schools are for children's lives. The last to close in a situation. Obviously,
Right.
there will be situations where we have to close that, but they should be the last sector of society to close and the very first to open. Before planes start flying, before casinos start operating,
Yeah.
before holidays begin, start schools.
Right. Have we, in a sense, have we recovered from this pandemic? I know we're talking about the vaccine and how things will go back to what they were. Have we recovered psychologically? Have we recovered mentally, or have we regressed in many ways? You've seen two societies quite closely now, over the last 9 months. What is has there been any fundamental change?
Because this is such a fast changing situation,
Yeah.
I can only speak for now. Maybe by tomorrow, the situation will change again. Some new variant will appear and etc. But from what we know right now, what we can see right now, I have to say I detect a real shift in mood. I find that people are a lot more optimistic. There is a sense that, okay, we've finally beaten this damn thing. And I have to say, there is a real growing confidence again in science, which I think is one of the positive things that come out of this whole pandemic. Because let's not minimize the miracle
Yeah.
that has happened in the last year. It's truly a miracle,
Yeah.
Kaveri. The miracle that just over a year ago, a new unknown pathogen spread across the world,
Right.
and in just about a year, we now have effective, incredibly effective
Right.
vaccines, many different ones as well. It is a true miracle of science. And I think if there's one positive, there are many things that should come out of the pandemic, of course. But amongst them, one that I think should really be very important is the value of science as a central component of a country's development policy. The other thing I will also add is the value of a strong public healthcare system, because where has the public healthcare system been until the vaccination campaign began? They are really the foundation. If today we're able to reach as many people as we have, it is thanks to our public healthcare
Yeah.
system. And
Absolutely.
I think this is another, for the first time, people of our class are going to government hospitals to get a COVID vaccine because that's the only place you could go. And I think we're finally seeing that this is a sector that belongs to all of us.
All of us.
And it is something we should demand our government to strengthen and invest in.
When we start doing that to our government schools, that's when real change will happen as well. These two sectors, if the middle class starts taking it seriously, I think, there'll be a world of change. But you talked about this confidence in science, but going forward, do you see it being part of policy in any way? Do you see, for instance, we've been working on the HIV vaccine for the longest time. Nothing came of it, although a lot of those people were actually redeployed to work on to research this vaccine. But given that this is supposed to occur or recur, do you think that value of science will remain?
Well, every virus is different.
Yeah,
The fact is, you're right about the HIV. HIV is not the only one. Malaria is another one.
malaria. Yeah,
So, it's not as if the immune response and to every pathogen is the same.
yeah,
So I wouldn't say, oh, we succeeded in
yeah,
COVID, but we failed in HIV. I think there are very fundamental differences between these infections. What I will say is that in spite of our mixed history of success against infectious diseases, the last year therefore must be seen as even a super miracle
right,
that an unknown pathogen a year ago has led to all these successful vaccines. If anything, I believe that this is a call to action, a call to arms. And by the way, I wouldn't only say this is a call to arms for our government, it also is for the private sector to invest in basic research and development, but also translational research, which is to say, a vaccine is only going to be used if you can prove that it works at the population level. So, what we really need is a kind of a pipeline
right,
from the lab, from the bench, where vaccines are being engineered, to clinical science, where vaccines are being tested in controlled settings, ultimately to population science, where vaccines are being tested on scale. And we've seen this happen remarkably with the COVID vaccines, especially the homegrown one, Covaxin.
right,
They've really gone through every step,
right.
and I think it's an exemplar of what India can achieve if they are provided, if people are provided with the right resources, both intellectual but also monetary.
I wanted to ask you about the deaths of despair, which you've been talking about for a while, the impact of the 2008 recession on mental health, and you divided it into the mood and anxiety conditions and substance abuse. Do you feel the recession sort of engendered by this pandemic will also have maybe a bigger kind of global despair? Will it remain?
So a couple of things, I think context is really important. Context is
Yeah.
terribly important for the pandemic. As we've
Yes.
seen right now, the countries with the least human resources for health and the least per capita spending on health have done the best.
Yes.
And
Which is so fascinating.
it is totally fascinating. And people say it's about India. No, it's not actually. India is actually a pretty high mortality rate compared to
Yeah.
Africa. So there's something else going on, and time will tell what it is. But I've always argued from the very beginning that context is important, and
Right.
a one size fits all has never been true of any epidemic. And it was absurd to me that right at the outset of this epidemic, we assumed that what happened in northern Italy, what happened in New York City, was immediately what was going to happen in Mumbai and Johannesburg. And I think it staggers the imagination that more than a century of knowledge about how important context is in the spread of the epidemic was thrown out, and we just assumed a one size fits all. Anyway, in the same note, you can apply the same to mental health. So, for example, the opioid crisis, as I mentioned earlier, in the US cannot be seen independently of the incredible medical industrial complex of the US.
Right. As you said.
And so that doesn't exist in India. For example, opioids are not manufactured in the kind of way they're in the US, etc. So I don't fear about opioids in India as I do in the US.
Right.
Similarly, when it comes to suicide, there is a very particular context in the US of suicide of particularly working class and especially white Americans. And a lot of that has to do also with white privilege and the loss of white privilege, particularly in rural
Right.
counties of the US. Again, that doesn't translate
Right.
to India in the same way. In India, what I would worry about is not so much the economic recession, because I believe that we will bounce back because, this is still a country with a huge internal market. I believe it's orthodoxy.
Right.
I believe it's polarization. I believe it's the rising oppression of young people to express who they are as individuals, whether it's their politics, whether it's social causes they champion, whether it's their romantic interests.
Hmm.
It is this which is the single biggest threat to young people's mental health. I also believe, to be honest, when it comes to farmers, that uh, if policies don't take into account their own economic security, and there are many ways of doing that. I'm not an expert in that, and I'm not making a judgment for or against the farm laws either. I'm just simply saying that whatever policies are made, if we do not take into account the vulnerable smallholding farmer we will get the same problem as we saw, as the US has seen, which is dramatic increases in suicide and substance use in the most vulnerable farmers, and of course, therefore, a worsening of our suicide crisis.
Absolutely. Great. It's been great talking to you, Dr. Patel, as always. It's so illuminating and you put everything into perspective and you give us context. And I wanted to recall Arundhati Roy's words in Harsh Pandhar's book, where she said the pandemic was not just a mirror but an X-ray. And I thought, wasn't that so perfect? It really was an X-ray of our society, of who we are.
Yeah, I think she uses the word the pandemic as a portal.
Yeah,
And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that's exactly the way I see it too. It has exposed historic divisions in our society. It
right.
has exposed a number of fracture lines in our
Yeah,
country. They've always been around. The pandemic has not created them, but it certainly brought them into full relief.
right. Thank you so much, Dr. Patel, for
Thank
talking
you,
to us.
Kaveri. Thank you so
Real
much for
pleasure.
interviewing me. Bye bye.
We hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to catch the other sessions of the ThinkEdu Conclave 2021, you can log on to eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, or even edexlive.com. If you are more of a social media person, you can also join us on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube handle. Thank you for watching.